More than 200 years ago, when Taranaki was teetering on the edge of what would be almost a century of war, Te Atiawa Hapu dismantled its most important public buildings and hid significant pieces in the Pero swamps just north of Waitara. 5 interconnected carved tōtara panels, likely the walls of a pātaka, survived the war and land theft, but were smuggled out of New Zealand 150 years later by a collector who took them to New York, Geneva, London and the Royal Courts of Justice. A new book launched last night tells their story. Te Motunui Epa, author and historian Dr Rachel Buchanan, no Taranaki Te Atiawa, is with us now. Tēnā koe, Dr Buchanan, thank you for joining us.
Tēnā koe, Neil, and tēnā koutou viewers. Great to be here.
What's the history of the Epa? Who carved them and when?
Yes, so these Epa would have been carved in the 1700s. We believe it would have been between 1750 and 1780 or so. I don't know the names of the tohunga whakairo who made these works, but to me that's not the most important thing. These works, you can see that the pātaka were made for several different, they've been joined together from several different pātaka. So what I'm saying is some of the carvings were made earlier, some were made a bit later. I think that, Neil, though, they were joined together to form a whole and would have only had a short life actually on the wall of a pātaka before they were dismantled. So I sort of see them as really special for a number of reasons. They were, I think, you know, these masterpieces created at the end of the old world, but obviously by people who didn't know that that world was coming to an end. So they are made by Te Atiawa people. They were asleep on Ngāti Rahiri land, but I see them as a taonga that's for all uri of Taranaki.
Well, talk to us about the journey then of Te Motunui Epa and how they finally made it home again to Taranaki.
Sure. What I love about these carvings is that they were asleep through all the wars that you mentioned in your intro. So much Taranaki history is to do with mamae, sadness and pain and loss. And this is a story where these tupuna were asleep and then they woke up in 1971, which was a time of great energy and activity, not just in Taranaki but elsewhere. You had the Māori language petition, you had all the land rights protests in Raglan up in Auckland, and the Epa emerged around that time. They were found by someone local who unfortunately made the poor decision to sell them to an art collector from overseas, who then smuggled them out of the country to an apartment near Central Park in New York. And there they lay on their own while this collector flew from Geneva, George Ortiz, to view them. Ortiz is a really fascinating man. His whānau descend from the Bolivian tin mining magnates. Their surname was Patino. And I got really interested, Neil, as I was researching this book. I wanted to make sure that it was told from a Māori perspective, but from the perspective of our tupuna taonga. So I tried to imagine them encountering each other on a marae and how it would be if the Ortiz whānau were introducing themselves. So I talk about that meeting between those two people, and then our taonga tupuna were sent to London, then to Geneva, where they were in the Ortiz mansion. So they lived in a really, really big house in Geneva in the middle of a forest. And a real mansion. They lived there for a few years and then were eventually put up for auction after George Ortiz's daughter, Graziella, was kidnapped by Italian criminals. So that's sort of where the story really sparks to life. And through a series of incredible coincidences, a man called Ron Lambert, who was then the new director of Taranaki Museum, actually caught wind of this auction and he got the tingle in his spine. He had an alarm bell ring off, and it was Ron's quick intervention that really prompted the government to act so quickly, Neil, to take action to protect our taonga. Now, if you think about 1978, last night at the book launch, Mātua Mahara Okiroa talked extensively about how we might try and understand this incredible series of events where a conservative government led by Robert Muldoon actually acted so quickly in favour of us, their treaty partner. It's really unusual behaviour in the 1970s and perhaps still today. So, yes, Ron Lambert was at the book launch last night, and it was beautiful to mihi to Ron for what he did speaking up. But, yeah, what happened then was all these public servants, all Pākehā people, just activated at the most incredible speed to, within about 2.5 weeks, the cabinet, they'd stopped the sale of the Epa. So that was the first time we might have lost our taonga forever. Who knows who would have bought them. they stopped that sale, but then they bankrolled this incredible legal action, which I really see in the book. I argue that it was just so groundbreaking at that time to go to the High Court of Justice, who found in New Zealand's favour. They found that, yes, the Crown did have a claim to the EPA, but the journey I really traced, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that, and they're a little bit stunning, but on their global journey, how did these panels then help to change repatriation practices, understanding and international law on cultural taonga?
Yeah, so I've worked a lot with the pepeha, or a bit of a fragment of a saying, ka utu te kino ki te pai. So obviously, I think these taonga managed to turn something bad into something good. So New Zealand failed, and we did all these appeals right up to the House of Lords, who found against New Zealand. But that effectively placed a rahui on these taonga, so no one would really buy them because it was just they were notorious. So the action taken by the government actually gave a lot of mana to New Zealand. And the first step was Jim Macleay, who was the Attorney General back then in 1983, gave an impassioned plea at the Commonwealth Law Minister's hui in 1983. And his action then led to the Commonwealth Scheme for the Protection of Stolen Cultural Property, which was published in 2017. Closer to home, the failed efforts back then to get the EPA back led the government to start reviewing its cultural property legislation. And in 2006, the Cultural Property Amendment Act was passed in Parliament. And that's what allowed New Zealand to sign on to the 2 international conventions, UNESCO and UNIDROIT, to protect cultural property. And it was really humbling for me, to read the transcript of Hansard debates where Māori and Pākehā from around New Zealand talked about stolen cultural taonga and what it meant to them.
Look, it's beautiful. Very quickly, how do we get your book?
It should be available in all great bookstores, or you can order it online or in libraries and in 500 schools from today as well.
Brilliant. Nice job. Author and historian Dr Rachel Buchanan. Thank you so much for joining us today. Ngā mihi nui.
Ngā mihi.